Welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating sociological mystery surrounding modern marriage dynamics. We're going to unpack some compelling psychological theories that the source material points to, looking at how clinical psychology, cultural scripts, and relationship breakdowns all kind of intersect. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to put the pieces together.
All right, let's just jump right into this absolutely staggering piece of data. 69%. That is the percentage of divorces initiated by women. According to the source analysis, this is a massive statistical asymmetry. But honestly, what's even crazier is that this number hasn't really budged in 70 years. Literally, for 7 decades, women have overwhelmingly been the ones filing the paperwork to end marriages.
Which brings us to Section 1, clearing the bad explanations.
So, to get to the bottom of this 69% figure, the source insists we really have to clear the slate first. We need to toss out those culturally default explanations that kind of cloud our judgment. The explainer systematically dismantles these usual suspects. Take infidelity, for instance. The data shows infidelity is cited as a primary reason in only about 37% of divorces. So even if every single instance of cheating was committed by a man, which the data definitely doesn't support, it mathematically just cannot account for a massive 38-point gender gap in filing. There absolutely has to be another engine driving these numbers.
Now, this is where it gets super interesting. Michael Rosenfeld's 2017 Stanford study gives us a wild contrast. He found that men and women in non-marital relationships, so just dating or cohabiting, actually break up at exactly equal rates. The source argues this is a real game changer because it demonstrates that the 69% asymmetry is a property of the formal marriage structure itself. It's not just some inherent male behavior across all relationship types.
All right, moving on to Section 2, the hidden mechanism, concept creep.
Having cleared those false leads, the source introduces us to this psychological concept that's just been sitting quietly in peer-reviewed journals for a decade. Back in 2016, a psychologist named Nick Haslam spotted a phenomenon he called concept creep. Basically, he noticed that really heavy clinical words, terms like trauma, abuse, and gaslighting, were escaping the medical literature. They were stretching outwards and downwards to define super common, mild, and highly ambiguous everyday relationship frictions.
The really crucial takeaway from Haslam's research is that when these words stretch to cover a mild disagreement, the heavy moral weight, the absolute gravity of the original clinical term, stays exactly the same. The words drift down to cover normal arguments, for sure, but they drag the severe moral condemnation of an actual clinical crime right along with them.
The source uses this to brilliantly illustrate a major shift in modern dialogue. I mean, just look at the difference here. Ordinary language, like saying, "we disagree about money," leaves a ton of room for negotiation. It's two equals having a conflict, right? But concept creep language, like claiming, "this is financial abuse," instantly pre-classifies an ordinary disagreement as clinical harm. The person saying it doesn't even need to prove anything. The extreme word literally does all the proving for them, and boom, the negotiation immediately ends.
Let's look at Section 3, Adler and Safeguarding Tendencies.
So, to explain why people unconsciously weaponize this extreme vocabulary, the source analysis turns to Alfred Adler. He's one of the founding fathers of depth psychology. Adler operated on this principle called teleology. He basically theorized that human behavior isn't just pushed by our past trauma, but it's actually pulled by unconscious future goals, specifically our fundamental human needs for significance and belonging. Adler observed that when our sense of significance or belonging feels threatened during an argument, our psyche automatically deploys these invisible safeguarding tendencies. It does this just to protect our fragile sense of self from feeling like a failure.
Let's break down how this actually builds in a modern relationship argument. When clinical language is thrown into the mix, it acts as the absolute perfect safeguarding tendency. Step 1, it reframes a negotiable preference into a totally unnegotiable injury, which protects the speaker's significance. Step 2, it draws instant validation from social media algorithms and peer groups, perfectly preserving their sense of belonging. And Step 3, it instantly ends the negotiation, completely eliminating any obligation to compromise with a supposedly toxic partner.
The source points out that this psychological machinery perfectly explains those Stanford study findings we talked about earlier. Think about it. In dating, it's pretty easy to just walk away. But marriage? That's a legal trap. Leaving costs money, status, your daily routine, and staying requires immense, sustained sacrifice. It is only when that legal structure locks in that the human psyche suddenly requires this extreme vocabulary to license an exit. Basically, concept creep allows someone to leave a perfectly workable marriage without ever having to surrender the moral high ground.
Which leads us to Section 4, the cultural vocabulary gap. But this brings up a massive question. If these safeguarding tendencies are universal human traits, we have to ask why this psychological machinery seems to operate with such a profound gender asymmetry, giving us that 69% statistic. Well, the explainer argues it all comes down to cultural scripts. For 40 years, our culture has built this massive, ambient public vocabulary detailing exactly what a man owes in a relationship. He's got to provide, be emotionally available, carry the mental load, and do the work to heal. This incredibly loud, constant cultural script acts as friction. It actually prevents men from easily claiming victimhood simply because culture is constantly asking him, hey, have you done the work? Have you been a better man?
The analysis points out a really stark contrast here. While we have this incredibly detailed male relationship script, there is an almost complete cultural silence regarding what a woman explicitly owes to a relationship in order to maintain a commitment. There just is no equivalent loud cultural standard demanding to know if she has quote-unquote done the work to be a better partner.
And this leads to a pretty profound conclusion from the source, because culture totally fails to provide women with a vocabulary for the ordinary, uncomfortable frictions of compromise and mutual obligation. Their psychological safeguarding tendencies run completely unopposed. When they experience relationship discomfort, they naturally reach for the very nearest, strongest words available to them in modern culture. And right now, that's the language of clinical pathology.
Let's shift gears to Section 5, the downstream consequences.
The explainer neutrally reports that this unchecked sociological machinery, this unopposed concept creep, is producing some devastating real-world outcomes that our public discourse largely ignores. When workable marriages are blown up by the language of harm, the downstream effects are severe. Just look at the data. Divorced men face a staggering 3 times higher suicide risk compared to married men, and a 6 times higher risk for alcohol use disorders. The source data clearly points out that divorce is actually one of the most powerful psychiatric triggers known in the medical literature. These tragic numbers exist largely because of how our emotional infrastructure is divided up. As Pew Research confirms, men systematically rely overwhelmingly on their wives for daily support. So when a divorce happens, men essentially walk out of the marriage and into an empty room. Women, on the other hand, are vastly more likely to turn to friends, their mothers, and extended family. They walk out of the marriage and straight into a pre-established support network. And guess what? The broader culture is watching all of this unfold. The source argues that the 63% of men under 30 who are currently single aren't just broken, immature, or afraid of commitment. Actually, scratch that. They are acting entirely rationally. They are actively observing this one-sided concept creep machinery operate. They're watching it destroy the lives of the men around them, and they are simply making the decision to opt out of the whole shebang.
Finally, Section 6, the path forward. The analysis doesn't just present this massive problem, it actually suggests a path forward. Now, importantly, the solution is not about taking clinical terms away from genuine victims of abuse. Those terms are absolutely real and necessary. Instead, the solution lies in balancing the cultural scales. The source proposes that we really need to fill that cultural silence we talked about by building a concrete, elaborate public vocabulary of what women actually owe in relationships, what compromise and obligation truly look like. Individuals will have a grounded metric to check their experiences against. It gives us a healthy alternative to the language of harm, potentially saving a lot of workable marriages from being destroyed by unchecked safeguarding tendencies.
We'll leave you with this final diagnostic question from the source to carry into your own life. Whenever you hear extreme relationship distress, whether that's scrolling on social media, chatting with a friend, or even in your own home, ask yourself, is this extreme language pointing at real, clinically significant harm? Or is it just the invisible machinery of safeguarding at work, shielding someone from the very ordinary, uncomfortable work of being in a committed relationship? So what does this all mean for the future of marriage? We'll let you ponder that one.